That morning, I opened my mailbox like I always did. Bills flyers, nothing unusual until one envelope stopped me cold. It was from the state Medicaid office. Inside was a document confirming that I had signed a long-term nursing home agreement. My name, my signature, my future gone. But here's the truth. I never signed anything. I was never even consulted. And buried in the fine print was the part that made my blood run cold once I was placed in a nursing home, my suburban house worth nearly $850,000. In our state, Medicaid can recover costs from your estate if you're placed in long-term care. So tell me, if this were you, would you fight back or stay silent? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the rest of this story. I've always been proud of how well I manage on my own. At 70, I still wake up early, lace up my sneakers, and head to the senior gym. My doctor says exercise keeps my joints from stiffening, so I never miss a session. Afterward, I drive myself to the grocery store, buy fresh vegetables, maybe a small cut of steak, and come home to cook. My pantry is neat. My refrigerator stocked, my pill organizer lined up with little compartments marked Monday through Sunday. People expect an old man to be scatterbrained, but I've worked hard to prove I'm not. Still, I won't pretend I'm perfect. There are small things that make me look more fragile than I like to admit. A few months ago, I forgot to pay the electric bill. The next week, a bright orange late notice showed up on my front door. I was furious. I called the company and spent nearly an hour on hold only to argue with a young man who sounded half my age. "Sir, you'll need to pay the late fee," I shouted back. "I've been paying bills longer than you've been alive, but in the end I paid. Technology isn't my strong suit either. I've tried online banking, but every time I log in, I seem to forget a password or press the wrong button. More than once, I've had to call my son-in-law Ethan to come help. He'll shake his head, smile, and say, 'Don't worry, Dad, I'll take care of it.' And then there are the scam calls. Just last week, a stern voice on the line said, 'This is the IRS. If you don't pay immediately, you could be arrested.' My heart raced until I hung up, cursing under my breath. I know better, but sometimes fear gets the better of you when you're alone. Ethan has been a blessing, or at least that's what I thought. He's always dropping by, offering to fix a loose shingle on the roof hall and heavy groceries, or drive me to doctor's appointments. He has a way of making me feel safe, protected. On my birthday, he showed up with a cake and said, 'You've been more of a father to me than my own dad ever was.' I nearly teared up right there. To have someone see me that way, it felt like I'd gained a son. My daughter Rachel, bless her, is gentle but quiet. She brings casseroles, helps tidy the kitchen, but she often lingers behind her husband. Whenever I thank her, she smiles and says, 'Honestly, Dad, Ethan takes care of you better than I do.' I laugh, but sometimes that stings. Still, I remind myself she's happy, and that's what matters. There were hints, though, small red flags that I brushed aside. Ethan once asked for a spare set of keys to my house. In case of an emergency, he explained. Another time, he suggested linking my bank account so he could help make sure the bills get paid on time. I hesitated, but he pressed his hand to his chest and said, 'Dad, you know I'd never let anything happen to you.' I gave in. Even the neighbors noticed. One evening, while I was trimming the hedges, Mrs. Carter from across the street called out, 'That son-in-law of yours is here more than you are. You'd better be careful, Thomas. I've heard too many stories of old men being pushed into nursing homes so the family can sell the house.' I waved her off with a chuckle. 'Not Ethan,' I said. 'He's different.' And then there's the house itself, a 2-story suburban home with wide windows, a broad porch, and the kind of lawn you can only keep if you're retired. I've lived here nearly 4 decades. Every beam, every nail I've maintained with my own hands. The neighbors gossip about its worth. That place has to be close to $850,000 by now. To me, it isn't just property. It's my legacy. The one thing I could leave to Rachel, to her children someday. That's why the letter shook me to my core. It arrived in an ordinary white envelope tucked between grocery store flyers and a dentist reminder. But the return address said the state Medicaid office. Inside, the document stated calmly, coldly, that I had signed an agreement to enter a long-term nursing home facility, effective immediately. I froze. My mind flipped back and forth. Was this some mistake, some clerical error? But there on the page was my name, my supposed signature. The letter congratulated me on securing care, outlining benefits and conditions. Buried in the fine print was the part that made my blood run cold once admitted to the facility, my suburban home worth nearly $850,000. My hands trembled as I read it again and again. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't even spoken to anyone about such a thing. Yet here was proof, at least on paper, that I had. Before I could gather my thoughts, Ethan appeared at the doorway. His tone was calm, almost rehearsed. "Dad, this must be some kind of clerical mix-up. Don't worry, I'll handle it." Rachel stood behind him silent, her eyes lowered. And in that moment a chill went through me, because sometimes the worst betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people already inside your home. So I'll ask you again. What would you do if you trusted someone completely only to realize you might have put your whole life in the wrong hands? On one particular morning, I decided to drive myself to the local supermarket. The cashier at the front, a young woman who had known me for years, smiled and said, "Mr. Miller, you always remember the sales better than I do." I laughed and joked back, proving to myself that my memory was still sharp. In the produce aisle, I bumped into Mr. Carter from across the street, who remarked loudly, "This neighborhood is booming. Thomas, your place has to be worth close to $850,000 now." He winked as if congratulating me, but beneath his tone I sensed envy, maybe even suspicion. I brushed it off, but a strange weight settled in my chest. Why was everyone suddenly so interested in the value of my house? When people look at me now, they see a 70-year-old man with gray hair, perhaps slower than I used to be. What they do not see is the road I walked and the weight I carried alone. My wife Margaret was taken from us far too early. Cancer stole her in the span of months, leaving me to raise Rachel by myself. I was father and mother in one. I still remember the nights when Rachel burned with fever. I sat at her bedside with a cold cloth pressed against her forehead, whispering promises that I would not let her go too. She was all I had left, and in my heart I vowed that every sacrifice would be for her. Rachel became not just my daughter, but the reason I kept breathing. The house we live in stands as the proof of that vow. I worked 40 years as a civil engineer, putting in long shifts, saving every spare dollar. When I finally bought the suburban house, I knew it wasn't just shelter, it was a monument to our survival. I hammered nails into the porch myself, patched the shingles, planted the lawn. Every corner of it is tied to a memory: Rachel's drawings on the fridge, her laughter echoing down the hall. I never saw it as property alone. It was legacy, the thing I meant to leave her when I was gone. One memory shines brighter than the rest: Rachel's 7th birthday. I worked a 12-hour day, but still came home with balloons tied to my wrist, baking a crooked cake because there was no one else to do it. She laughed when the candles leaned sideways, clapping her hands as if it were the grandest feast in the world. Her joy erased every ache in my body. Years later, at her college graduation, I stood in the crowd clapping until my palms were red. When she crossed that stage, I thought to myself, every late shift, every sacrifice had been worth it. Those 2 days, her birthday and her graduation, live in me as proof that I kept my promise. And then came Ethan. He was polite, courteous, the kind of young man who shook your hand with confidence. Rachel glowed when she introduced him. I thought maybe at last she had found someone who would cherish her as I had. When they married, I paid for the entire wedding, every flower, every glass of champagne. I wanted her day to be perfect, and I wanted Ethan to know he was family now. At first, he acted the part. He helped around the house, grilled burgers at family barbecues, cracked jokes with the neighbors. I remember one summer afternoon when he stood at the grill flipping steaks, calling me Dad with an easy smile. I thought, yes, this is what family should feel like. He tried a few business ventures, some failed, but I didn't hesitate to help. I gave him loans, told myself it was normal. I wanted to believe I had gained a son. That belief carried me into the hospital months ago when I needed a minor surgery. It wasn't life-threatening, but enough to make me uneasy. Ethan volunteered to drive me to handle the paperwork, to speak with the doctors. "Don't worry, Dad," he told me, patting my shoulder. "I'll take care of everything." Rachel sat beside me holding my hand, but it was Ethan who filled the forms, who talked with the nurses. I felt strangely relieved letting someone else take the reins. For once, I thought I wasn't alone. But anesthesia is a thief of memory. I recall the mask lowering the sting of medicine in my veins, the lights above me blurring into nothing. Hours vanished. I woke groggy, unable to keep my eyes open, too weak to hold a pen. I could not have signed anything, not even my own name. And yet, according to the papers that surfaced later, that was the moment I supposedly agreed to abandon my home and move into a nursing facility. That realization cut deeper than any scalpel, because it meant that the very trust I had given, the trust built over years of sacrifice and love, was being twisted into a weapon against me. I had spent my life constructing walls of protection for Rachel, and yet the breach came from inside, from the man I had welcomed as a son. I look back now and see the arc of my life with painful clarity. A widowed father who fought to raise his child, who built a house to prove his devotion, who believed he had gained a son-in-law worthy of that trust. And now, all of it bent toward betrayal. My story is not just about contracts or signatures. It is about the danger of trust misplaced, about how quickly devotion can be turned against you. As I sat in my living room holding those damning papers, I realized that what I had built over 70 years could vanish with a forged stroke of a pen. And worse, that my daughter might be swept away with it. That thought led me into the storm that followed. I sat at my kitchen table, the Medicaid letter spread out before me, and the walls of my own home felt suddenly unfamiliar, like I didn't belong here anymore. My hands trembled as I stared at the words again: long-term nursing facility admission. It was my name, my signature, my future signed away, but I hadn't signed a thing. When Ethan came by later that evening, I didn't waste time with small talk. I held up the letter, my voice sharper than I intended. "Care to explain this?" He glanced at the paper, calm as ever, like he'd rehearsed this moment. "Dad," he said with that soothing tone of his, "you signed those papers at the hospital, after your surgery. You probably don't remember, it was a stressful time." I felt the air go thin. "No," I shot back. I was unconscious. I couldn't have signed anything, but Ethan reached into his briefcase, sliding out a folder thick with documents. "I thought you might be confused," he said smoothly. "That's why I brought copies." He spread them across the table like a magician laying out cards. Each page bore my name, and then he showed me the one thing I couldn't argue with: a notarized form. My signature scrawled at the bottom next to the notary's embossed seal. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The paper was heavy in my hands. Real, official, legal. I felt my certainty falter, replaced by a terrifying thought. What if I really had signed? What if the anesthesia had scrambled my memory more than I realized? Ethan leaned closer. "Look, Dad, this isn't a bad thing. Nursing homes are safe. You'll get all the care you need. Rachel and I, we just want what's best for you." I slammed my fist on the table. What's best for me? Dripping me of my life, taking me out of my home. My voice cracked, anger tangled with fear. He didn't flinch. "You're not thinking clearly right now. This is all legitimate. The notary signed off, the hospital witnessed it. It's all above board." Later, I took the documents to a lawyer I'd worked with years ago. He skimmed the pages, frowned, and finally said, "If that's your signature and it's notarized, the court will presume it valid. Overturning it will be extremely difficult." This was not a routine admission form. It was a notarized financial authorization executed while the patient was under anesthesia. I left his office with a pit in my stomach, clutching the folder like a death sentence. A few nights later, I sat in my living room, the TV buzzing in the background, when I decided to read the documents line by line. That's when I found it. Buried in the details under the section marked Financial Responsibility were the names of the people listed as the responsible party for billing. Not me. At first I didn't understand. Why would they pay? But then it clicked: the moment you enter a long-term facility under Medicaid, your home can be liquidated to cover expenses. Whoever signed on as guarantors of payment would have control of the process. Ethan's voice echoed in my head. "We'll handle everything, Dad. Don't worry." It wasn't generosity, it was strategy. The next morning, Ethan dropped by with Rachel in tow. He placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Dad, don't stress about the finances. Rachel and I are covering the fees. You should feel relieved." Relieved. My blood boiled. "You mean I spat you're setting it up so you can sell my house out from under me? My house, the one I built, the one I've lived in for 40 years. Rachel flinched, her eyes darting to Ethan. She whispered, "Dad, please," but stopped when Ethan tightened his grip on her hand. I turned on her. "Rachel, did you know about this? Did you agree to this?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Ethan answered for her. "We're just trying to make sure you're cared for. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I wanted to shout to tear the papers in half to throw them into the fireplace, but the notary's seal burned in my memory, the lawyer's words echoing extremely difficult to fight. In that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt truly powerless. The days that followed blurred together, but the weight never lifted. Every time Ethan came around, his words were wrapped in silk, but underneath I could hear the steel. He reminded me to rest, not to overexert myself, as if I were already some frail man in a nursing home bed. One night, I heard Rachel's voice from the kitchen while she thought I was asleep. She asked Ethan quietly, "Do we really have to do this?" Her tone was fragile, trembling. Ethan's reply was sharp and low, but I heard it. "Don't question me. I'm doing this for us, for our future." I lay awake in the dark, my heart hammering. My own daughter, my only family, was standing by the man who wanted to erase me. The house creaked around me, the same familiar sound it had made for decades, but for the first time, it didn't feel like home. It felt like a cage, and Ethan held the key. One afternoon, Rachel stopped by without Ethan. It had been weeks since we'd been alone together. I seized the chance. I poured us tea, sat across the table, and asked the question that had been burning in my chest. "Rachel, tell me the truth. Did I ever sign those papers?" Her eyes filled instantly. She looked down, twisting her napkin in her lap. "Dad, Her lips trembled. She was on the edge of confession. Then, like a curse, Ethan's voice echoed from the doorway. "Honey, I need you for a minute." Rachel froze, her words dying in her throat. Ethan stepped into the room, phone in hand, smiling like nothing was wrong. "Come take this call with me." She stood slowly, tears glistening, and followed him out without another word. I sat there alone, my heart pounding. My daughter wanted to tell me the truth, but Ethan's shadow smothered her voice. A few days later, Rachel met with her old college friend at a cafe downtown. She thought I didn't know, but one of the neighbors saw her there. Later, that friend called me worried. "Mr. Miller," she said gently, "Rachel's torn apart. She told me she feels trapped between you and Ethan. She cried the whole time. She said, 'If I go against Ethan, I'll lose my marriage. If I stay silent, I'll betray my father.'" My chest tightened. I could picture her at that cafe, hands trembling around a cup of coffee, tears staining her cheeks. Her friend told me she'd urged Rachel to choose what was right. "Ethan is dragging your family into something dangerous," she said. "But Rachel's afraid. She doesn't think she can stand up to him." Hearing that shattered me. My daughter wasn't cruel. She wasn't blind. She was just weak. And weakness in the hands of a man like Ethan was as dangerous as betrayal. Suspicion clawed at me. I started checking the places I kept my paperwork: an old metal filing cabinet in the study, a locked drawer in the desk. Files were shuffled out of order, some folders half open as if someone had rifled through them. My gut twisted. Then came the whispers. At the grocery store, I overheard two neighbors chatting. "Did you see Ethan last week? He was talking to that realtor, the one who sells half the houses on Maple Street." "Yeah, I saw him too. Maybe he's planning something big." The blood drained from my face. Ethan wasn't waiting for the nursing home arrangement to finalize. He was already moving towards selling my home. My home. That evening, Ethan and Rachel came over. Their smiles were thin, their eyes rehearsed. They sat me down in my own living room as if I were a guest in my house. "Dad," Ethan began, voice honeyed, "we've been thinking about your future. Nursing homes these days aren't like the old ones. They're modern, safe, full of people your age. You'll have everything you need, no stress, no bills, no risks." Rachel nodded, though her eyes were red, swollen from crying. "It might be good for you, Dad. You wouldn't be alone anymore." That was the moment I broke. The fear, the confusion, the humiliation, all of it erupted. I slammed my cane against the floor, my voice roaring louder than it had in years. "I never agreed to this. Do you hear me? I never signed anything. This is my house, my life, and I will not be pushed out." Rachel jumped sobbing into her hands. "Dad, please." But Ethan's eyes hardened, his mask slipping. He leaned forward, his words sharp as knives. "You don't have a choice, Thomas. The papers are signed. The law is on our side. It's only a matter of time." For a moment, the room fell silent, except for Rachel's muffled cries. The walls seemed to close in the house I had built with my own hands, suddenly under siege from within. I stared at them both, The daughter I'd raised, the man I had trusted, and I felt the last piece of my old life shatter. But beneath the despair, something else began to stir. A fire I hadn't felt in years. If they thought I would just fade quietly into the background, they had misjudged me. So I'll ask you, the people listening now, what would you do if your own blood, your own family cornered you like this? Would you stay silent, or would you fight back? The arguments with Ethan didn't stop at the kitchen table. They followed me like shadows through every corner of the house. One night I confronted him again, this time with the neighbors within earshot. I demanded, "Explain to them, Ethan, did you see me hold a pen? Did you see me write my own name?" He smirked, replying, "People forget things, Thomas. You're not as sharp as you think." The words stung, not just because of the insult, but because Rachel's silence beside him seemed to agree. Later, Rachel slipped into my study while Ethan stepped outside to take a call. She touched the stack of papers on my desk, her lips trembling. "Dad, I want to tell you something, but..." Before she could finish, Ethan's voice rang from the hallway and she froze, stuffing the papers back into the drawer. Her chance to speak vanished, swallowed by fear. At a cafe the next afternoon, Rachel confided in her friend, tears staining the napkin she twisted in her hands. "I feel trapped between them," she whispered. "If I betray Ethan, I lose my marriage. If I betray my father, I lose my soul." Her friend's reply was sharp. "You already know the truth. You either stand with your father now, or you'll regret it forever." Rachel only bowed her head, unable to commit to either side. Back at home, I began noticing signs of Ethan's ambitions spilling out into the open. Files in my cabinet were shuffled, financial papers missing. A neighbor mentioned seeing Ethan speaking with a realtor on Maple Street, their conversation hushed but heated. The pieces were falling together. Ethan wasn't just setting me up for a nursing home. He was preparing to cash in on my house before I even left it. The night it all came to a head, Ethan and Rachel sat across from me, their voices carefully rehearsed. "Dad," Ethan began, "think about your future. A nursing home isn't abandonment, it's comfort, care, safety." Rachel's eyes glistened with tears as she added softly, Maybe it wouldn't be so bad." That was the moment something inside me snapped. My voice thundered across the room, louder than it had in years. I never agreed. This is my house, my life, and I will not be erased. Rachel buried her face in her hands, sobbing. Ethan's smile vanished, his words hardening into steel. "You don't have a choice, Thomas. The papers are signed. The law is on our side." The room crackled with tension. A family bond splintered beyond repair, yet deep inside the despair a spark caught flame, the realization that if I didn't fight now, there would be nothing left to fight for. After that confrontation, the house felt unbearably quiet. I sat in my recliner staring at the framed photos on the mantel. Rachel's graduation, her wedding holidays where we all smiled like nothing could break us. Now every picture felt like a lie. The silence pressed against my ears, broken only by the tick of the old grandfather clock. $850,000. That was what the neighbors whispered my house was worth. To me, it wasn't about the money. This house was Margaret's laughter in the kitchen, Rachel's tiny footsteps on the stairs, the place where birthdays and Christmas mornings came alive. To lose it would mean losing every proof of the life I had built, and worse, it would mean surrendering my dignity. I thought of Margaret often in those days. The night she passed, she had gripped my hand with what little strength she had left and whispered, "Take care of Rachel. Don't let her lose herself." I'd carried those words for decades, and now I felt I was failing her. Rachel wasn't just being misled. She was being used, turned into a pawn by the man she trusted most. One night, I caught sight of Rachel through the half-open door to the guest room. She thought I was asleep. She sat at the desk, a copy of the nursing home contract spread before her. Her shoulders shook as silent tears fell onto the page. She scribbled something in a small journal, then quickly shut it when she heard Ethan's footsteps. He entered, his voice sharp. "What are you doing up?" She shook her head, wiped her eyes, and whispered, "Nothing." She tucked the papers away, her secret buried again. That image haunted me, the sight of my daughter torn in half. A few days later, I learned she had gone to see an old friend, a lawyer she'd known in college. She asked timidly, If my father was under anesthesia, if he couldn't possibly understand what he was signing, would that make the contract invalid? The lawyer's answer was cautious. With proof, it could be challenged. But you'd need solid evidence. Courts don't overturn notarized documents easily. When Ethan found out about that meeting, the storm hit. Neighbors told me they heard shouting from Rachel's house that night. I didn't need to imagine the rest: Ethan's rage, Rachel's tear-choked apologies, her fear tightening the chains he held around her. For days after Rachel avoided me, she dropped off food at the door but wouldn't stay. When our eyes met, hers darted away like a guilty child's. I wanted to reach out to hold her the way I did when she was small, to tell her it wasn't too late. But Ethan's shadow loomed too large. And me. At first I considered giving up, letting them take the house, letting the tide wash over me. I thought maybe if I just step aside, Rachel will be happy. Maybe peace is worth more than walls and floorboards. But then Margaret's words came back sharp as glass. Don't let her lose herself. If I gave up, I wouldn't just lose the house, I'd lose Rachel. I'd be teaching her that betrayal is acceptable, that silence is survival. I couldn't let my daughter's soul be dragged into Ethan's schemes without a fight. So I made a decision. No more wavering, no more silence. I told myself, if I stay quiet, they'll steal not only my home but my daughter's conscience. If I fight, maybe I can save them both. That night, sitting in the dim light of the living room, I felt something shift. I was no longer just the victim of forged signatures and lies. I was a father, with a duty, a man with nothing left to lose, but everything to protect. And I began to prepare. So what do you think? Is silence sometimes a form of strength, or is it simply weakness dressed in disguise? Tell me your thoughts. In the sleepless nights that followed, I sat in the dim glow of the living room lamp, questions gnawing at me like restless wolves. Had I been too soft on Rachel? Had I mistaken Ethan's slick charm for genuine care? The thought tortured me that perhaps my own blindness had placed the knife in my back. I remembered the day Rachel graduated college. I stood in the crowd, clapping until my palms ached, shouting her name as she crossed the stage. My chest swelled with pride, thinking all the overtime shifts, the sleepless nights had been worth it. Now, replaying that memory, I felt the sting of betrayal, sharper than ever. What had happened to that bright-eyed girl who once ran into my arms with her diploma? Rachel's torment didn't go unseen. Late one night, I discovered her journal left open on the desk. I shouldn't have read it, but my eyes betrayed me. In shaky handwriting, she had scrawled, "Mom, if you can hear me, I'm sorry. I don't know who to stand with. If I choose Ethan, I betray Dad. If I choose Dad, I lose my marriage. Please forgive me." I closed the journal with trembling hands, a tear sliding down my cheek. She was still my daughter. Still that frightened child searching for guidance in the dark. But guidance was something Ethan would never give her. His grip was too tight, his vision too narrow. If Rachel couldn't break free, then I had to do it for her. I couldn't allow her to be chained by fear any longer. At first, I nearly gave in. I thought, let them have the house, let them take it all. At least Rachel will be comfortable. But then Margaret's voice echoed in my mind, her dying words. Take care of Rachel. Don't let her lose herself. I realized surrender wasn't love. It was cowardice disguised as peace. So I hardened my resolve. I whispered into the silence of the living room, if I remain silent, they will steal not only my home but Rachel's conscience. But if I fight, maybe I can save us both. The decision was made. I would no longer be a victim. I would become the one thing Ethan never expected, an old man who refused to vanish quietly. That night, I felt Margaret's presence in the house, as if her spirit stirred in the walls, urging me forward. For the first time since this nightmare began, I believed I could win. And that belief, fragile as it was, became my greatest weapon. After days of sitting in my own silence, I decided I couldn't live that way any longer. Fear had been eating me alive, but now it was time to fight back. If Ethan thought I was too old, too weak, too confused to defend myself, he was about to learn otherwise. I went back in my mind to that day at the hospital, the day of my surgery, the anesthesia, the way it pulled me under like a deep tide. I remembered the ceiling lights fading, the sound of voices turning into muffled echoes, the sharp smell of disinfectant. And I remembered the nothingness after that. No papers, no pens, no signatures, just unconsciousness. That memory was my anchor. If I could prove I was under anesthesia, prove I couldn't possibly have signed, then the whole scheme would collapse. The trick was finding someone who had seen me that day, someone who could speak the truth. A week later, I visited the hospital under the pretense of picking up medical records. In the hallway, I recognized a face, Nurse Linda, the one who'd checked my vitals before the surgery. I approached her slowly. "Linda," I said, my voice low. "Do you remember the day I had my procedure?" She tilted her head. "Of course, Mr. Miller. I was the one who monitored you in recovery." I swallowed hard. "Did you see me sign anything? Papers, contracts, anything at all?" Her brow furrowed. "Sign, no. When I checked on you, you were still groggy from anesthesia. You could barely lift your hand, let alone read or sign documents." My chest tightened. "Are you sure?" "Positive," she said firmly. Then she hesitated, lowering her voice. "But I do remember something odd. Your son-in-law was in the hallway with a man I didn't recognize. He was carrying a folder. Later, I saw them go into your room together. When I came back, they were leaving and you were still asleep." Her words struck me like lightning. Ethan hadn't just bent the truth, he had orchestrated the entire fraud. That night, I called an old friend, Jerry, who worked in hospital security. We'd known each other for years, and when he heard the desperation in my voice, he agreed to help. 2 days later, he slipped me a USB drive. "Don't ask how I got it," he warned, "but this is from the cameras in the East Wing day of your surgery." At home, I plugged it into my laptop and watched. My hands shook as the grainy footage played. There was Ethan striding down the hallway, a folder under his arm. Beside him walked a man in a suit carrying a notary bag. They stopped outside my room, glanced around, then went inside. Minutes later, they emerged, the folder still in Ethan's hand. I leaned back in my chair, my heart racing. There it was, the proof I needed. Ethan hadn't just lied. He'd dragged a notary into my hospital room while I was unconscious. I decided Rachel deserved to know. The next time I saw her, I told her about Linda's statement in the footage. Her eyes widened, her face pale. "Rachel," I pleaded, "you know I couldn't have signed. You know I was under. Ethan tricked everyone. He's trying to take the house." For a moment I saw the little girl I once knew, the one who used to cling to my leg when she was scared. Tears filled her eyes. She whispered, "Dad, did he really?" Her words cut off when Ethan appeared at the door. His smile was tight, his voice sharp. "What are you two talking about?" Rachel stammered. "Nothing. Just catching up." But I pressed, "Tell her, Ethan. Tell her how you brought a notary into my hospital room while I was unconscious." His jaw tightened. "Careful with your accusations, Thomas. You're confused. You don't know what you're saying." Rachel's voice shook. "Ethan, is it true?" He turned to her, eyes blazing. "I'm doing all of this for you, for us. Your father can't take care of himself forever. We need that house. We need security. Stop asking questions." Rachel broke down, sobbing into her hands. Ethan pulled her close, but she stood rigid, torn in two. I knew then that the battle wouldn't be won in whispered conversations or tearful pleas. It would have to be fought in the open, in the one place Ethan thought he couldn't lose court. I began preparing. I gathered the Medicaid letter, the notarized forms, the payment records showing Rachel and Ethan as guarantors. I collected Linda's written statement about my condition under anesthesia. And most importantly, I held on to the hospital footage showing Ethan with the notary. Each document, each file I placed in a folder, labeling them carefully. My hands shook not from weakness, but from determination. This was no longer about saving my house. It was about exposing the truth, about saving Rachel from the grip of a man who would use her own father as collateral. In the quiet nights, I sat at the dining table rehearsing my words. I imagined Ethan smirking across the courtroom, Rachel's tears soaking into her hands, the judge's stern eyes scanning the evidence. I wasn't just an old man fighting to keep his property. I was a father keeping his promise. The morning of the hearing arrived heavy with tension. I put on my best suit, the same one I'd worn to Rachel's wedding. It felt strange buttoning it now, years later, as if the fabric carried both memories and warnings. Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered, curious about the case. Elder financial abuse wasn't a phrase you heard every day, but it carried weight. A few snapped photos as I walked up the steps, cane in hand, folder tucked under my arm. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet voices. Ethan sat at one table, crisp suit, confident smirk. Rachel sat beside him, pale eyes downcast. I took my place at the other table, my lawyer beside me, the evidence ready. When the bailiff called the court to order, the room fell silent. Ethan glanced at me across the aisle, his smirk widening. He thought the notary's seal would protect him, that my age and frailty would make me crumble. But he didn't know what I carried in that folder. He didn't know that I had found my fire again. I sat up straighter, looked him dead in the eye, and thought, this isn't over. Not by a long shot. I sought out the anesthesiologist who had overseen my procedure. He pulled up my chart and confirmed without hesitation, the dosage you received would have left you unconscious for several hours. There is no possible way you could have reviewed or signed any document. His clinical certainty bolstered my resolve. Later, when I watched the hospital hallway footage again, my hands trembled on the keyboard. The sight of Ethan leading the notary into my room twisted my stomach, but as I rewound the footage a second time, determination replaced dread. I whispered to myself, this will be the evidence that saves everything. The courtroom was cold. Every sound amplified the shuffle of papers, the cough of the bailiff, the steady tick of the clock on the wall. I sat there, heart pounding, as the judge examined the stack of documents Ethan's lawyer had presented. The notary's seal gleamed under the fluorescent lights, unshakable, undeniable. Ethan's attorney stood tall, his voice smooth. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The contract is notarized, properly filed, and legally binding. Mr. Miller himself may not remember signing it, but that does not make it invalid. The judge nodded slowly, flipping through the pages. My chest tightened. It felt as though the walls were closing in. Around me, the room seemed to lean toward Ethan, every glance and whisper suggesting I had already lost. My lawyer whispered, stay calm, just wait, but all I could feel was the weight of defeat. Then my lawyer stood and cleared his throat. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to introduce one final piece of evidence. All eyes turned toward us. He pulled out a small USB drive, slid it into the courtroom's screen system. The monitor flickered, and suddenly the grainy footage of a hospital room appeared. The timestamp glowed in the corner, the day of my surgery. On the bed there I was, eyes closed, tubes taped to my hand chest rising and falling in slow, medicated rhythm. I was completely unconscious. The video rolled on. The door opened. Ethan stepped in, folder in hand. Behind him followed a man in a dark suit carrying a notary's bag. They hovered at my bedside, flipping through papers, pointing at lines, nodding to each other. But one thing was undeniable: I never moved. My hands never lifted. My eyes never opened. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, face stern. Mr. Notary, did you witness this man sign these papers? The notary's face flushed crimson. His voice cracked. I was told he had already signed. I was misled. He stopped, burying his face in his hands. I didn't see him sign. I trusted the son-in-law. The judge's gavel struck the bench. Then this contract is null and void. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Relief flooded through me like air rushing into drowned lungs. My house, my home was safe. The legacy Margaret and I had built still stood. Ethan's face twisted, his composure cracking. The judge's words rang out. This matter will be referred for investigation into elder financial abuse. Rachel broke, then sobbing loudly into her hands. She turned to me, her voice pleading. Dad, I'm so sorry. Please, please forgive me. I looked at her, my only child torn between love and disappointment. My heart ached with the weight of her choices. I wanted to gather her up like when she was a little girl, but the words that came out were different. Con fai tu chuak loy, I whispered in my own tongue, then louder in English. You'll have to redeem yourself, Rachel. I can't do it for you. I turned, cane tapping against the floor, and walked out of the courtroom. Outside, the humiliation spread like wildfire. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. By evening, the local paper's headline read, Elderly man nearly loses $850,000 home to son-in-law's scheme. On TV, anchors replayed the footage of the hospital video, Rachel's tears beside Ethan's stony glare. By the next morning, the clip was everywhere. Neighbors gathered outside, some shaking their heads, others muttering loud enough for cameras to catch, shame on him. How could a son-in-law stoop so low? Their voices added to the wave of humiliation. A neighbor's cell phone recording of the verdict had gone viral on TikTok, millions of views overnight. On Facebook, strangers debated whether Rachel deserved forgiveness, comments pouring in karma. How could a daughter let this happen? I watched it unfold from my quiet living room, the house still mine, the walls still humming with memories. Justice had come, but so had exposure. Rachel came to my door, her eyes swollen, voice breaking. "Dad, please, I made a mistake. Don't shut me out." I stared at her, my heart torn in two. "I love you, Rachel, but love isn't blind anymore. This is your burden now. You have to make it right." I closed the door softly, leaving her sobs on the porch. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Rachel wiped her tears and spoke haltingly. "I was wrong. I betrayed my father by staying silent. I want the world to know I'm sorry." Cameras flashed as her public apology spread a small step toward redemption. So tell me, should I forgive her? Should a father overlook betrayal when it comes from weakness, not malice? Share your thoughts in the comments. And as the evidence played, something unexpected happened. Rachel suddenly rose to her feet, tears streaming down her face. Her voice cracked but carried across the courtroom. "Stop lying, Ethan. Dad never signed anything. You tricked me. You tricked all of us." The room went silent, every head turning toward her. For the first time, Rachel broke free of Ethan's shadow. It was the moment she reclaimed her voice, a public redemption that no one could ignore. Ethan's mask shattered. He slammed his fist against the table, shouting, "This is fake! You're all against me! He's an old man who doesn't even know what he's saying!" His voice echoed too loud, too wild. He sneered, "You think anyone cares about an old man's house?" The judge banged the gavel, warning him to calm down, but Ethan only grew more frantic. Deputies stepped closer, their hands hovering near his shoulders. The confident son-in-law was gone. What stood there now was a desperate man exposed before everyone. The audience gasped, some whispering, "Unbelievable," others shaking their heads. In that moment, humiliation was complete. Rachel denouncing him, the court watching his outburst, the truth undeniable. If you were in my place, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. Stay safe, drink water, and take care of yourself. Thank you for watching.